Recording started. There we go.
Thank you. Welcome everybody to another Therapist Connect broadcast, which is part of our very first conference. For those who don't know, my name is Dr. Peter Blundell, and I'm a lecturer in counselling and psychotherapy at Liverpool John Moores University, as well as a co-facilitator of the Therapist Connect community. Our community is about bringing together therapists to talk about different therapy-related topics. And we've discussed a lot of different ideas and topics already at this year's conference. And for details of those, if you check out our website, which is running across our screens at the moment, or check out our social media details, which are also on screen. There's lots of other recorded free debates which you're able to access there, so go take a look. But today I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special panel discussion on the topic of psychotherapy integration, which includes a panel of therapists who are all experts in their field. Before we introduce our panel, if I can introduce you to our panel chair, who is Dr. Kate Smith. Kate is an academic, researcher and practitioner in pluralistic therapy. She's head of Division of Health Sciences at Abertay University in Scotland, where she also runs the Research and Training Clinic. She's also a governor of the BACP. Her primary research interests are in the process and outcome of pluralistic integration and training in that approach. So thank you very much, Kate, for chairing this discussion. Could I ask you to introduce our panelists?
Yes, thank you, Peter. Okay, I'm going to give a brief introduction to all the panelists who've joined us today. First of all, I'd like to welcome Marvin R. Gottfried, who is a distinguished professor in psychology at Stony Brook University, where he was involved in developing its graduate program in clinical psychology. In addition to teaching clinical supervision research, he maintains a practice of psychotherapy in New York City. Among his many professional accolades and leadership roles in the field, he is a recipient of several awards from the APA and other professional organizations, and most recently received the APA Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award for the application of psychology. He's the founder of the journal In Session, Psychotherapy in Practice, an editorial board member of professional journals, an author, co-author, and editor of several books, including the Rorschach Handbook of Clinical Research Applications and Converging Themes in Psychotherapy, Handbook of Psychotherapy Integration. Dr. Gottfried is co-founder of the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, founder of Affirm, Psychologists Affirming Their Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Family, and founder of the two-way bridge between research and practice. Now, I know we're online, so I'm going to have to imagine a little warm welcome applause before I introduce our next guest, who is Alberta Poss. Alberta is an associate professor in the adult clinical stream of the Department of Psychology at York University in Toronto and maintains a private practice also in Toronto. Alberta was trained in emotion-focused therapy by Les Greenberg and Jay Watson while participating in clinical trials at York University. An international trainer of emotion-focused therapy, her research centers on change processes, research particularly in applying and adapting emotion-focused therapy to personality disorders. Alberta received the Sepi New Researcher Award in 2011, was an associate editor for the Journal of Psychotherapy Integration for 2 years, and will be the next president of Sepi from January 2021. So right now, I guess, in conference terms.
Exactly.
Our third guest is Catherine Eubanks, who is an associate professor of clinical psychology at the Verkauth Graduate School of Psychology in Yeshiva University in New York. I hope I've pronounced that right. I'm not convinced I have. She's the associate director of the Mount Sinai Beth Israel Brief Psychotherapy Research Program. She's serving as the president of the Society of the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration in 2019. And her research is in the area of psychotherapy processes and outcome, in particular negotiating therapeutic alliance ruptures. The goals of her research program are to identify therapist skills and characteristics that are linked to effectiveness across various theoretical orientations, and to explore how therapist skills can be enhanced through training. So welcome. It's wonderful to have you with us today. I'm going to start with what I think is a relatively simple question, and for our audience, I think it's an important one to start. So I was wondering if you could tell me, perhaps, Marv, if you could start. What do you see psychotherapy integration to actually be? How might you explain it to a new client or someone unfamiliar with the idea?
It is a simple question. Unfortunately, the answer is a little bit more complex. And psychotherapy integration means different things to different people. Let me just say what I think it means to me. What it means to me is that the field of psychotherapy, having been in existence for well over 100 years, according to standards of scientific development, is still pretty much an infant field. And it's an infant field because there are competing approaches. And numerous different schools of thought have been developed with its own special jargon. And according to Thomas Kuhn, this is indicative of an infant science. What I think of integration is being able to get some kind of consensus, of trying to get people from different orientations to really focus on what they can agree. And it's it seems like an easy task, but it is very, very complex.
It's like herding cats.
Exactly like herding cats, which is an understatement. But from my point of view, it's looking for common principles, common processes of change. It's speaking with a single language. It's thinking at a certain level of abstraction where people can agree. I don't think they can agree theoretically, because there are just so many different theoretical schools of thought. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, different intervention techniques. So I don't think we can find the commonality there. But at a level of principle, the principle being a certain amount of motivation and positive expectation is required for change to occur. A certain therapeutic alliance can serve a very important role. Helping a person become aware of certain things in their lives that are causing them problems, and then acting on that awareness to try to change things. So this is at a general principle level, and we can get into more and more details, but I think this is where I look for psychotherapy integration. The attempt to come up with a core, an agreed upon core, as to what contributes to the change process. Now, there are differences, and the differences can be very, very important, but I think I'll have more to say about that later. Give some of the folks a chance to give their views.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Marv. I think that there's, I mean, we all know that we all tend to have our own kind of clubs that we belong to. We have our own languages, or someone is CBT, someone is psychodynamic, someone is experiential or whatever, has EFT or DBT background. And I'm thinking that when you're really an integrationist, you're the kind of person who cares less about being a card-carrying kind of proponent of one particular approach, and more about what Marv talks about as having an access to or an understanding of kind of the cross barriers processes that develop and align and help people change, you know. So I think things that he's talking about, like when Marv talks about, he's talking about the middle ground for or principles of integration or principles of intervention. And so we're not so much concerned, we're more of a couturier kind of matching what the person needs in this particular moment, and less off the rack kind of just doing, you know, this in session 1, this in session 2, and this in session 3. So we have to be more sensitive to the client when we do integration. And I think that's sort of a basic principle of the integrated therapist, is they're paying attention to the client more than they are to the approach.
Yeah, I think And this is something that's not exclusive to integrative people or integrative therapists, but I think at its best, somebody coming in with an integrative mindset is really brings like a curiosity and a humility. Like, I know I don't have all the answers and my approach doesn't have all the answers. And I really am interested in learning anything I can that will help me respond to my clients' needs. And even if I end up doing something that's within one particular approach, just that openness to learning about other approaches and in a respectful way, I think is really valuable.
I think that's so true.
A way to summarize what both of you are saying is that the integrative therapist has more of an interest in meeting the needs of a patient than following the dictates of
And belonging to a club.
Right. So it's, and from my point of view, when you put it that way,
being humility.
Compelling.
So it's something about where does your allegiance lie? Does your allegiance lie to your client well-being, or does it lie to your desire to be doing the right thing? Because
I think that's really interesting. What you're talking about is different ways of being an integrated therapist. I think there's a way where I could be, I can have an allegiance to a particular approach and I integrate other pieces into that approach. That's one way, called assimilative integration. Or we can do what's called a common factors approach to integration, which is like more like what Marv talks about, is understanding principles of change and integrating those into some sort of thing. And of course, there's theoretical integration, which is like super ambitious, which is bother, or we don't think that we'll ever reach. We do have an allegiance and an openness and a humbleness. So we're more interested in what we can't do than what we can do, so that we can look across, the field or go across the fence and see, oh, that person's doing something that I can't do. Why are they doing it? Why does it work? I think that's part of it.
And I think that leads very beautifully into the next question I was going to ask, which is what is the Society of Psychotherapy Integration? Is that its purpose? Again, Marv, do you mind if I start with you?
Well, that's what I always thought its purpose should be. And this is when Paul and I decided to talk about what we can do to get some dialogue across different theoretical orientations. It was kind of set up as an interim step toward a larger purpose, the larger purpose being meeting the needs of the patient rather than staying within our school of thought. So Paul and I would meet on this, and we knew that there was a lot of people from different orientations that were unhappy with their school of thought. They saw it as being inadequate, but didn't say anything, except didn't put it in writing. And it would usually be discussed after the conference meetings when everybody was at a party or sitting at a bar. And Paul called this the therapeutic underground. People writing the books and doing the research within CBT saying, I don't think that CBT is really the answer for everything. Well, they preface it by looking around first. And then they would say that. So this was the underground. And then Paul and I would then meet for lunches in New York City to talk about what we could do. And then he and I developed a serious relationship. We knew we had crossed the line when we couldn't meet for lunch anymore. And we started to meet for dinner. And then we got other people involved. And we decided we set up an organization where people from different orientations would talk to each other. So that was kind of the origins of Sepi. It was to open up lines of communication of those people who were silently talking to their colleagues about the limitations, and they would talk to other people from other orientations, and then maybe find out that the limitation of my orientation might be complemented by the strength of yours.
I wonder if Catherine, you've been more. So how did that?
Sorry, can you say that again?
I suppose that, that's a wonderful ambition. Is that sort of continuing through? Is it?
I think so. I mean, I think Sepi is so first it's a really it provides this opportunity to really interact in meaningful ways with people from other approaches. So you definitely see a diversity of approaches there that I don't think you see in other organizations. And another element of integration that I think is being emphasized more and more is also the integration of practice and research, and the chance for practitioners and researchers to talk to each other. Because that's also a divide in our field that causes a lot of problems, and where people can stereotype the other side, not be receptive to meaningful dialogue with the other side. And so I think that's also an important place where Sepi can fulfill a really special role.
I agree totally with that, because I think there's this issue around, people who are academics, they think they're the be all and end all, and they know everything. And the people who are clinicians think that the academics know everything and they don't know anything. And when they actually do know a lot, and it's important for clinicians and researchers to talk to each other. And I think that clinicians often, there's kind of disjunct about how people talk about research and clinical work not dovetailing enough, that somehow people are saying that research is irrelevant because they don't get anything out of it. And that's the important thing, is that we need to have clinical people telling us what to do and what to be doing that research on. And I think that's a really huge piece of the communication and the openness that we as a group have that is important. I think it's really an important piece, is the communication and dialoguing that goes on between the researcher and the clinician and the different approaches, and that we're not afraid to talk to one another. I think that's the biggest part.
It's an interesting, I mean, the idea of evidence-based practice, we talk a lot about evidence-based practice, but actually the fluidity of that you're trying to achieve there can sometimes be very, very difficult. And I think perhaps it starts at the point of training, when people kind of get their heads around the influence of research.
It's a very interesting piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Like, I have a master's student now who's doing something on emotion as a common principle. And she's basically talking about she's examining across multiple perspectives independent of the therapy approach. So the idea is that something that's a common factor should be independent of whatever approach you use. Mm-hmm. Show up as something that's important, mathematically speaking, independent of where a client comes from or what kind of therapy a client is undergoing.
Mm-hmm. And so does Sepi, just because I think our audience will not be very familiar with what you do, are these sorts of conversations sort of accessible to people, say, in the UK, people who are interested in them? How does that, or maybe we'll come to that later, but these are sorts of, are there invitations into these conversations for people? I'm not sure who I'm asking, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I know that in England you seem to be very CBT focused. That's all I'm aware of. So I'm not sure if that's true or not. But so we're a little bit looser, I think, in our approaches somehow.
I think the CBT is a side effect of the National Health Service. But I think there are many different approaches, but probably only one main one within the service.
Exactly.
Probably agree with me there.
I mean, it is. I do want to make sure the viewers understand it. Sepi's an international organization, so even though you've got 3 North Americans here, we do have active members in the UK and other parts of Europe, Asia,
Portugal,
all over the world. So it's definitely, and we really welcome that, and really, and we also have regional networks, which are kind of smaller local groups in different areas to try to promote local events and local connections. So it's definitely, we really welcome members and interested people from all over.
I think that's wonderful. I think one of the other benefits of engaging in Sepi is possibly that when you are within a particular culture, or within a particular country, you see what therapy is provided there, and you imagine that maybe it's the same everywhere else, and obviously it's there's a range.
An interesting thing too is about how we do research. I mean, even Catherine, who does a lot of research on the Alliance, for example, there's a measure of the Alliance called the Working Alliance Inventory that was developed by
Adam Horvath.
Adam Horvath and Les, developed in '87. But I mean, interestingly enough, even if you use a measure that's very consistent across many approaches, it's still being used within a particular specific approach to therapy. And so you're always going to get a kind of matchup or interaction between a particular measure and an approach that's using that measure. So we have to be careful to not be too preciously kind of attracted to the idea of having a common factor, because we might not have as much of a common factor as we realize. And that will be a really, I think, important piece of the future research, to be able to develop measures that are not quite, so what's the word I want to use? Not quite so anchored in a particular way of thinking about something.
So something that's a little bit more open to various schools, sort of interpreting them.
Exactly.
I think that leads very, very nicely into the next question I was going to ask. And again, Marv, I'm going to turn to you. This is really speaking from a place of being a researcher of many years' experience. I was wondering if you could tell me what you feel the most important research evidence for integration or integrative approaches is, and maybe how that should impact on practitioners. What influence should that have?
Well, I think, let me back off a bit and speak more generally. I think that, at least within the US, the predominance of clinical trials over the past 30 plus years has distorted the whole notion of what evidence is. And I don't know if this exists in the UK. I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say about that, Kate. But there are people now who grew up with only knowing clinical trials as evidence and don't realize that there are other forms of evidence that are as important, if not more important. So I think basic research evidence is extraordinarily important. And I think in the US, the NIMH has this concept of translational research, where they say basic research could be used to understand what is going on clinically. Well, that's a very, very old notion. That notion's been around for decades. And I very much ascribe to the notion that basic research can inform us. So basic research on, in social psychology, on attribution of motive, where it's clearly demonstrated that people have interpersonal conflicts because they misinterpret the motive of another person. Not because of what the person has done, but because of what they believe the motive to be. And that if you change that motive or get them to see that there's another potential reason for a person's behavior, their thinking and their feeling and their actions change. And this is demonstrated research. Now, is there relevance of that basic research to practice? Oh, obviously it is. And what's the theoretical orientation of the practice? There is no specific theoretical orientation. It's extrapolating from basic research. So there's a lot of this basic research that's important. And then there's process research, which tells us what did the therapist do in order to bring about change. Now, talk about the split between research and practice. There's no split here. What is the question that therapists ask themselves? What can I do?
What should I do? Yeah.
On this patient. So the research evidence is what was done to make an impact on the particular patient. So I think if we look at research in another way, then schools fall apart.
I agree with you.
Let me finish, Alberta. Okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
Because I got to get this out. Okay.
Yeah. Of course, it's your turn.
Okay. I've been tweeting, and one of the tweets that I've done is, how many people go to a physician and ask that physician, what's your theoretical orientation to practice? It's a stupid question, because the practice is based on research findings. I mean, we're seeing this all over the place, all over the world. Science is what's going to help us deal with COVID. Well, it's the same. It should be the same thing for therapy. Basic research and applied research, rather than theory, is what should dictate. But it's got to be the right research. Alberta, your turn.
So also, I think one of the main findings that we've discovered that actually is really helping you make that point is the dodo bird effect. The fact that, like, for example, that we have all these different, we have these horse race trials where we pit CBT against dynamic, or we pit DBT against some other approach, or we pit, and then everyone, it's all the same. It's like, so everyone, that's an indication that something is, we're all doing something similar-ish. And that's one of the sources, I think, of research that really supports integration, is that we might as well find out what we're all doing. I mean, that's one of the interpretations, that we're all doing similar things. I think the other thing that's really interesting is the process research that's been done by John Norcross. He's got that book called Psychotherapy Relationships That Work. So he's got all these processes that are looked at independent of the therapy. So empathy, independent of the approach to therapy. The alliance, independent of the approach to therapy. Or assimilation, approach into, and all of those things are actually showing us that basically there are processes that go across many schools of therapy that are similar-ish. And I think those also support psychotherapy integration as well.
You want to say anything, Catherine?
Well, I think between the two of you, you've covered everything I was going to bring up. I was also, I mean, we have evidence that these common factors contribute to good outcome across approaches, across modalities, across populations. That's pretty powerful. And then, as Marv's pointing out, it's important when we start talking about being tied to the evidence, that to make sure we understand how we're defining that. So just RCTs, just randomized controlled trials, is actually a very limited view of what constitutes evidence. There's all different kinds of ways of doing research, including increasing efforts to have practitioners be an active part of that, and be, talking about what's happening in their practice, and tracking what's happening in their practice as a really valuable form of evidence to then guide researchers. So that it's really a bidirectional process.
Exactly.
So I think these are all really important future directions for the field.
I think there's something, there's increasing conversations in the UK around triangulation models of research data. So sort of bringing in case studies plus outcome trials plus, sort of looking at all
stuff.
If you're more ahead of that in the States than we are, but it feels important.
There's also something about client-driven integration. I think that's really important, that we're all grappling with. The more complicated people get, the more likely we're going to have to look across the field and see what other people are doing to see what's working. So it's also individual differences is also a big kind of driving force in the integrated field, I think.
But I'm a pluralist, so that's where we base our practice. I'm not going to argue with you there, but I wonder if there is something there about, the research evidence does point to integration, or it points to some things being better at some times, or at least, at the very least, it points to flexibility from a practitioner. But yet we still have schools, and we still have particular theoretical approaches that people will sort of adhere to. I don't know if you have any thoughts about why does that feel difficult to sort of challenge?
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon, because people have identities.
Yeah.
And their identities sometimes center around schools and leaders of schools. Okay? a Freudian, a Jungian, an Adlerian. We've gotten away from that. Now we have acronyms. CT, BA, CBT,
Blah, blah.
ACT, PE. I'm in the process of developing my own particular school, which is going to be called Marvin's Marvelous Psychotherapy Intervention. This is an easy acronym, MMPI.
People will be Googling that now, you know, Marv.
Marvelous Marv.
But I'll tell you what the school would be. The school would be, here's what goes on in therapy. A person comes into therapy, their life is not working, and they don't know why. There are factors that are contributing to the problems that they always seem to have. So you could say that they're not effective or they're not competent in certain aspects of their life, but they don't know why, which we can call unconscious incompetence. So they work with the therapist within a good relationship. The therapist helps them to be motivated to change, because those two are very, very important. And then they work together to help the person become aware of what it is that's making their life not work, which brings them now to the phase of conscious incompetence. So they know why they have the problem based on historical stuff, based on contemporary problems that they have. And of course, they ask the next question, hopefully, and that is, well, what do I do to change?
Yeah, now what?
And now they move into conscious competence. And over a period of time, which some people call working through, they practice, and it becomes easier for them to function in a new way and reach a phase of unconscious competence. So if we understand it that way, then now we have to fill in the details. But I do think what we need to do is we need to start answering the question on what can we agree, and come up with as many answers to that before we say, well, here now we depart. And then the question of, why do we depart? Because our great leader says we should depart, or because our great leader has a certain set of techniques that maybe can work for certain kinds of problems. So if we figure out what the needs of the patient are, why their life is not working, and what would happen, that what they would need to make their life work, then the technique, the theoretical procedure, can be any school of thought.
That's right. Once I know, I have
That's
to make
my MMPI.
different recipes.
I think in thinking about the question of why the schools still exist, it's also, I mean, therapists are more human than otherwise. So therapists also need community, and they need, you know, frameworks and things to help organize their thoughts. And so I think that's also a place where they need friends, they need networks. So this is also, I mean, one of the valuable things about Sepi is it does provide a way to have community without that community being defined solely by a theoretical orientation. And I think it's really with promoting, it's like promoting any form of diversity. You know, people need to have the chance to have meaningful interactions with people who are different from them. And so giving people that opportunity, either like through Sepi or also, you know, in the training process, so that you know, when we talk about a different approach, it's not this abstract idea, but it's like, you know, real flesh and blood people who are interested in that approach. And I think those can really help people sort of start out the field more open-minded.
There were other factors too, and I don't know if you remember this, Catherine, of when we spoke about identities and how we identify each other. Do you want to say something about that?
So I was, so Marv was my mentor in graduate school, and we were having this conversation about how we identify, and Marv was talking about sort of identifying as CBT, being integrated, but sort of coming from CBT. And I was talking about the different approaches I had been exposed to very early in my training. I had the chance to be exposed to a lot of different things. And so I was sort of listing, well, I had some of this and some of that. And I said, well, maybe I'm really integrative. And Marv said, or maybe you're confused.
No, that was part of it. But the other part was, no, the part that I'm remembering is, I said, integrative? Why are you integrative? And then you said, because I learned it from you. And I thought, oh my gosh, I was teaching her to be integrated for my identity with CBT. So identity is very, very important. Like religion, we may not be practicing the tenets of the religion, but that's our identity. And I think I think we're just used to being Freudians, Jungians, or whatever. It's a habit of thought that's existed for
It is a habit.
time.
I was reading a book lately by a woman who's a psychodynamic psychotherapist. It was, who was it? It was the woman who developed SASB, Lorna Benjamin, it was. So it was a book written by Lorna Benjamin. And inside this book, she identified emotion-focused therapy, which is an experiential humanistic-based home, as a psychodynamic therapy. And I thought, holy smokes. Like, this is really interesting. And I became this whole thing about, I thought about identity, that what Marv talks about. And I also thought about how it must also be very difficult. I mean, I know there are people in the world who teach integrative approaches to psychotherapy. I think we do a fairly good job of it at York. And I think Franz Kaspar does a good job of it at Bern. But it's almost like it's not an easy thing to do. To actually have, like, we have a really nice, we had Morris Eagle, we had Les, we had Laura Rice. We're missing a really strong CBT person. Marv, you should be at York. We need a strong, I mean, now we've got CBT, we've got dynamic, we've got EFT, all of that is still there. We've got trauma. So it's much easier to start with some basic processes like building a strong alliance and creating an awareness and, experiencing stuff. That's sort of a fundamental kind of thing that we're doing. But I think it's one of the reasons why it's difficult to do, or why people the trainings aren't as integrative, or why people's schools still exist, is because it's so freaking hard. And I think that's part of what Catherine's talking about. We need clubs, we need groups to belong to, we need friends, we need funding, if you don't belong to X, group, you don't get any dollars. You can't do the research, all that stuff. It's part of it all.
Well, there's also, there's the economic part that we cannot overlook. The referral source.
Yeah, exactly.
And back in the 80s, when the NIMH was doing a comparison of interpersonal therapy with cognitive therapy, which they called cognitive behavior therapy, which was an error. It was really Beck's cognitive therapy, but they called it cognitive behavior therapy. I would get phone calls. My practice, do you do cognitive behavior therapy? And I said,
exactly.
Yes, I do. And then I would imagine all those people who didn't do it and would say, no, I don't. And then my fantasy was, how many phone calls do they have to have before they start doing cognitive behavior therapy and get the training? So getting
it's so interesting, because it's also about flavors of the month and what's popular and what a client will say they should be getting, because someone tells them that they should be getting this. So for example, we have that a lot we do an in-house clinical practice where we have people come in and get practice and they get therapy. So we had a student there who was doing emotion-focused therapy with the client, and the client told her that she needed to do cognitive behavioral therapy because that's what her psychiatrist had told her she had to have. But when she did the cognitive behavioral therapy, the client said, oh, I want that other therapy that you were doing. Let's do the stuff. So it was like, oh, so this is also about, what people identify as what's important and what's the flavor of the month and what they should be getting, whether they get it or not. That's also another piece.
That feels really significant, because I think clients like to know, they like to understand what it is that they're receiving. And if the information they're getting is from, broader context, from society, then it would be hard as a clinician to kind of.
It's hard to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, one of the things I tell my patients is I tell them there are the 4 stages of unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence. And they love that. And they would come in and they say, you know, I did something and I did it without even thinking. I guess that's, and they pause and then say, that's unconscious competence. So they have this as a way of a structure of understanding where they are in the change process. And there are other things too that you can give them that are trans-theoretical. And
very orienting.
And then they're fine with that. And if it's working, and then you say to them, look, I don't follow a given school of thought. I tailor the therapy to what you need the most, rather than to somebody who says, here's what the theory says. They're not going to object to that. If you've got the good bond.
That's a very nice way of describing it, Marv. You're describing things well, making sense to them.
I've been practicing a lot.
But maybe that's something that we need to do in training, to teach the therapists how to explain to the client what.
I agree. I think one thing that we've been very, very bad at, from our point of view, from an EFT point of view, from a humanistic experiential point of view, is that explicit psychoeducation that people really need. They need to be oriented. They need to know what they're doing and why they're doing it, and not just be left to do it because that's what you're supposed to do according to that model. I think we have to be able to say, this is what I do and this is why I do it. And you know, I think that let's try to figure out a way that to work that will fit you, that will make sense to you, that will somehow make you respond in the way that we want you to respond. It's important.
So I wonder if I might go back to the idea of training. So it sounds like there's something around it's useful to identify, and I suppose particularly when you're starting out, knowing who you are and what you need to do feels really important. But if you're going to be integrative, where do you start? How do we train integrative therapists? And Marv, I'm going to start with you again.
Well, what I'm going to do is defer to Catherine, because Catherine has a wonderful model of training when it comes to dealing with alliance ruptures. And I think that is a wonderful prototype of how training should take place in the 21st century. I think it is revolutionary. Yes, revolutionary. We've been training, we've been supervising and teaching stuff the same way, which makes no sense whatsoever. It's haphazard. Catherine?
Well, that's wow. That's quite a intro. So what Mark's referring to is alliance-focused training, which was originally developed by Chris Moran and Jeremy Safran, and I collaborate with Chris and others on continuing to develop this and disseminate it. And it's an integrative approach. It draws a lot on experiential tradition, cognitive therapy tradition, psychodynamic traditions, and something that's really important to us is it's not another brand of therapy. It's helping therapists build good alliances and be more attuned to when there's a problem in alliance and have tools to use in those moments. And you can integrate that into any approach. Any therapist can, benefit from this and apply this when they need to. And we really focus a lot on therapists becoming more attuned with their own experience and really recognizing, they're also in the room, they're also part of what's happening. And I think that helping therapists become more self-aware is just really
huge.
So useful across so many areas, but really essential when you're dealing with a challenging moment with the alliance. So we do a lot of, we do some psychoeducation for trainees and teach them, here's ways alliance ruptures, what they might look like, things you can be alert to, but also really be paying attention to what's going on for you internally. And then practice role plays and we do it in a group supervision, so the role plays are kind of stressful. You've got all these people watching you role play, but that helps. Practicing under that pressure helps prepare you for a difficult moment with a patient. And so really, and really the goal is you just increasingly become aware of what's going on for you and what's going on between you and the patient, and then increasingly comfortable talking about it. That's more than half the battle.
Yeah, I think that's such an important piece.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Marv.
The component too that you have to add to this is that what you're teaching them is not theoretically based, it's evidence-based. It's based on your research and based on the research of other people about the importance of the alliance, about ruptures in the alliance. It's from the laboratory to the clinic. And that is key. That is key. And then it's also based on critical incidents or on markers of here are things you are likely to see clinically, and here's how you
what it means,
it, and here's how you handle it.
Yeah, this is what it might mean.
Can I ask a question then?
Sure.
Just clarification. This is what you're talking about is something about the nature of the relationship and the capacity to go back over the relationship and pick up on things which are not working. Is that right? I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, so the idea of alliance ruptures is when there's a problem in the alliance, a tension, a disagreement, a strain in the bond. And research has taught us that these things can happen a lot, that if they're not addressed, they can contribute to poor outcome or the patient quitting therapy prematurely. And that it can be hard sometimes for therapists to recognize it when it's happening, or to recognize early subtle signs of it before it becomes a huge problem.
Exactly.
And then even if a therapist recognizes it, they may feel anxious or frustrated, or their own reactions and feelings may get in the way of them being able to handle it kind of in an empathic, collaborative, compassionate way. So, and so sort of training therapists to be alert to, oh, this is a sign my patient is maybe getting uncomfortable, or my patient's pulling away from me, or my patient's kind of challenging me, or I'm just starting to feel uncomfortable in the relationship. I need to pay attention to that and not ignore it. That's telling me something. And then what am I going to do? Do I need to change how I'm proceeding? Do I need to have a conversation with my patient about what's going on and kind of explore this difficulty? And as Marv said, it's always in the context of a research program where we're always like studying it and doing more research on it to refine our understanding of it and further develop it.
And in addition to what Catherine is doing, Mike Constantino at UMass and James Boswell at Albany are also doing this, taking up clinical events, or as it's sometimes called in process research, markers, where something is observed within the session and then the therapist has to does something about it. And they are working on things like patients' expectations for therapy, which may not be good, and picking up on that and how you change the expectation, or waning motivation and how do you deal with that. So the alliance, expectation, motivation, what's the theoretical school? It's trans-theoretical. So this is a whole radically new approach to training. It's in its very formative stages. When I've described this to my graduate students and supervisees, they say, oh boy, I'd love to be trained that way. Because
so
what you do, what you have is you've got a body of research, you have clinical guidelines, and you have video clips to demonstrate what to do.
So are you saying that what we should be doing is having more of these difficult moments and then addressing them with like the markers with these difficult moments?
Absolutely. Now this was attempted back. This was attempted back in the 50s. And Hans Strupp did his dissertation on this in the 50s. Of showing films, and then what would you do next? People wrote a book, Corsini wrote a book, Critical Incidents in Therapy, but it was not refined, it was too global, and it was not based on an empirical gathering of critical incidents or empirical gathering of markers, or going to the research literature to see what areas have been researched. And so this is a whole new way of changing training and also changing how we think. So, Catherine, I don't think there are going to be any Eubankians.
Oh, please no.
So I'm curious about how Peter and how are you hearing all this that we're talking about? Do you resonate with that, or?
Well, so I teach on a person-centered experiential course at Liverpool John Moores University. But one of the things that I think I've noticed a lot actually over the past 12 months engaging with the Therapist Connect community, which is across all different modalities, and the kind of hundreds and hundreds of different therapists I've spoken to over the last 12 months, is actually when you start to talk about your practice and what actually happens, that there is a lot more common ground, I think, than people quite often give it credit for.
Realize.
And yeah, but that people realize. And I think there is something in kind of what Marv was talking about there before about that idea of your identity as a therapist and who trained you and where you came from. And I think there's a lot in that actually. And I've just found the work of Sepi really interesting about kind of bringing people together to kind of see what have we got in common, you know, and what are the differences and kind of what works and what doesn't work. And so I think it's been really interesting to hear all of those kind of discussions today and see where kind of you're going as an organization really, and kind of the objectives, which I think is really interesting. It's been great to hear.
One thing that's really interesting is that I think that there's a misnomer, or there's a kind of bad press that sometimes people have gotten about Sepi that I think should be corrected. And I think that we've done a good job in correcting today in terms of this idea that it's a scientifically minded, empirically based research. I think people sometimes think of integration, because I still remember there was a person I knew who went for an interview here for a job in the city, and she went and had a conversation with a job attendee or a job interviewer who was very CBT oriented. And he said, "Oh, I hope you're not one of those integrationists," kind of thing. And his idea was that a person who did psychotherapy integration was not a scientist, but was one of these musher types who just did whatever, like had a bag of tricks and just did whatever they wanted to do. They wanted to do it. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a very principled, scientifically founded, based way of integrating that's different than just mushing about.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what I absolutely agree. I mean, pluralism is a framework for integration, and I trained in it. And so it's interesting that I actually identify as the pluralist. So I've started as an integrative therapist, so I think it's easier for me to sort of sit here and say, yes, absolutely. You know, these are the things that we need to be asking ourselves, and these are the ways we need to change practice. But I am aware that, you know, there is an accusation, I think, that even integrative therapists have started to become a little schoolist. What kind of integrative are you, or what do you know? What flavor of integration?
Yeah. What flavor of integration do you practice?
That's right. It's a sort of emergent quality of people, you know, deciding they're doing something, is that other people are doing something different, maybe.
Well, you know, Thomas Kuhn writes about this, and he says that there are going to be people that will never ever change. And then he says, eventually they will die out, and the new generation,
they'll drop dead.
The new generation will lead the way to a new way of looking at things. And this is precisely why I tweet. People are thinking, you're tweeting? With a chuckle. And yes, because that's where the new generation is.
That's where they are. Yeah, that's what they're doing.
And so what would you like them, where would you
To
like
read
them,
about.
What's that?
where would you like the new therapists to start? Where
Oh,
do we grow?
there
we
are
grow?
just so many places to start.
Okay.
They can start by joining Sepi. They can start by reading some stuff. I mean, Catherine has an article in the Journal of Psychotherapy Integration, which I just read today, which I thought was great. It was part of, it was a commentary on, well, what did you say, Catherine?
A commentary on the Hightop, which is an effort to sort of have a diagnostic, like a hierarchical diagnostic system that's different from the DSM.
Okay.
That's
And,
empirically based.
Yeah, and it tries to be more grounded in research than the DSM is.
And that it takes characteristics of different types of people you're likely to see and kind of groups them. And the point that I really liked in your paper, Catherine, was when you said, well, if a certain type of person is an avoidant type of person, then when there's an alliance rupture, look for X, Y, and Z,
Right.
because they're likely to withdraw.
To do this, yeah.
Say something wrong. And it's like, oh my God.
That's the integration between individual differences and the common process.
Absolutely. Like, oh my God, it's starting to happen.
Cool.
Sounds wonderful. I'm sure we can put a link for that article in the.
Yes, I'm going to go read it right now.
That's amazing, really. So I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our time, and first of all, I just want to thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I wish we did have more time for discussions. But I guess I would invite you, is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience today?
My gratitude to both Peter and Kate, and you, Kate, for putting this together. I think it's
yes. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
No, thank you all. Oh no, thank you all for coming along, because I know that you're all really busy. But I think it was a really, really interesting conversation to have. And I think, as Kate was saying before, particularly for our UK audience who might not be familiar actually with the work of Sepi and kind of understanding what that's about. I have been running across the bottom of the screen the Sepi website and Twitter handle just throughout that discussion as well.
Thank you.
You can go and access that and look up at some of the discussions that you've been having. And I suppose it's just for me really to kind of close the discussion and say thanks very much to the Therapist Connect community for watching. And if you were interested in this debate, maybe to rewatch it or some of the other discussions we've been having this week, our website and social media details are running across the screen right now. Thank you everyone for all of your time. It was really very interesting. And thanks, Kate, for chairing.
No problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay.